Oil just crossed $101 a barrel. Gas prices are at a 2.5-year high. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important waterways on the planet, is still closed. And the United States is rushing thousands of paratroopers and Marines into the Middle East right now. But here's what makes this story really wild. The White House is telling the press the war is already won. If that doesn't add up to you, good. Because in the next 20 minutes, we're going to break down exactly what's happening on the ground, what it's doing to the global economy, what it's doing to your gas prices, your mortgage rate, your grocery bill, and why the picture looks a whole lot more complicated than what you're hearing in the headlines. Stay with me because this one matters. Hey everyone, welcome back to Frontline Finance. I'm Lauren. And if you're new here, this is the channel where we take complicated global situations and break down what they actually mean for your money, your economy, and your everyday life. No spin, no noise, just the facts and the numbers. If that's the kind of content you're looking for, hit subscribe right now so you don't miss what's coming because we're going to be covering this story as it develops. There's a lot to get through today, so let's get right into it. Let's start with what's actually moving on the ground right now, because the scale of this deployment is something a lot of people are underestimating. The 82nd Airborne Division has been ordered to deploy to the Middle East. Now, if you're not familiar with the 82nd, here's what you need to know. This is not a standard unit. These are paratroopers, elite soldiers based at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, trained specifically for one purpose: rapid forced entry into contested territory. They are designed to seize airfields, ports, and strategic positions anywhere on the planet within 18 hours of activation. 18 hours. That's not a slow buildup. That's an emergency response force. The unit that got its orders, the 1st Brigade Combat Team, holds what's called the Immediate Response Force Rotation. That means roughly 3,000 soldiers are ready to move at any time, day or night, on extremely short notice. And here's something interesting that didn't make many headlines. Weeks before any public announcement was made, the same headquarters element was quietly pulled from a major training exercise at Fort Polk, Louisiana. No public explanation. The people inside the building weren't surprised. Everyone else was. Now, the 82nd isn't going in alone. Not even close. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit is aboard the USS Tripoli and is expected in the region by Friday. That's approximately 2,200 Marines and sailors. The 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, which was originally assigned to the Indo-Pacific, was rerouted to the Middle East last week. It's traveling with the Boxer Amphibious Ready Group, and that group carries F-35B jets capable of vertical takeoff. That's another 2,200 personnel. Add it all up, and you've got somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 troops heading toward the Gulf right now. Defense analysts and Senator Lindsey Graham have pointed to Karg Island as a likely strategic objective. That island sits 16 miles off the Iranian coast and processes the vast majority of Iran's oil exports. Think about that for a second. If you want to apply maximum economic pressure on Iran, that island is the pressure point. Open-source flight tracking has also picked up something worth noting. Dozens of transport aircraft departing airfields associated with special operations units over the past 72 hours. Delta Force, SEAL Team 6. That is not a defensive posture, that is staging for something. Now let's talk about what happened on the same day the White House declared the war essentially over. Iran launched the 79th wave of Operation True Promise 4. The strike package included Khaybar Sheikhan, Imad, and Sajil precision-guided ballistic missiles alongside IRGC suicide drones. Targets included areas around Tel Aviv and Dimona. 79 waves. Let that number sink in for a second. Most people assume that after 4 weeks of strikes, Iran's missile capability must be running low. The reality is actually the opposite. The IRGC has shifted its strategy. They've moved from high-volume saturation, flooding the sky with as many missiles as possible, to low-volume, high-impact precision. The missiles are fewer, but they're bigger and they're smarter. The warheads now crossing into Israeli airspace weigh over 1,000 kilograms each. And roughly half of them, according to Reuters, are carrying cluster warheads. Here's why that matters, and this is the part that's changing the entire math on air defense. When a cluster warhead reaches a certain altitude, it separates. It breaks apart into dozens of individual submunitions, bomblets, that scatter across a wide area. And once those bomblets separate, they are effectively impossible to intercept. The window to stop a cluster attack is before the missile breaks apart. Once it does, it's over. During one tracked engagement window, 14 Iranian missiles got through Israel's air defense grid without being intercepted. 11 of those 14 were cluster munitions. The Israeli Air Force is now in a position where they are conserving interceptors, deliberately choosing which threats to engage and letting some through, because the stockpile cannot keep up with the incoming rate. Iron Dome interceptors cost around $50,000 each. Arrow 3 interceptors run over $2 million per shot. Iran's ballistic missiles cost a fraction of that to produce. And Iran still has an estimated 1,000 ballistic missiles in reserve. When you do that math, that's spending 5 to 10 times more per engagement than your adversary spends to attack, and your adversary still has 1,000 missiles left, that equation trends toward one thing: exhaustion. Okay, now let's get into the part that directly affects your wallet, your gas tank, and your broader financial picture. Because what's happening in the oil market right now is genuinely significant. Before this conflict began, Brent crude, the international benchmark for oil prices, was sitting at around $70 a barrel. That was a relatively stable, manageable level. Then the war started, and the price chart starts looking like a seismograph. When the US and Israel first launched strikes on Iranian territory, prices jumped. When Trump threatened to target Iranian power plants, Brent crude spiked to $190.50 a barrel. That's almost a 70% increase from where we started in a matter of weeks. Then something interesting happened. Trump went on Truth Social and announced that peace talks were underway. He posted that the US and Iran had held productive conversations toward a complete resolution. He announced a 5-day freeze on strikes against Iranian power plants. The oil market reacted immediately. Brent crude dropped 13% in a single trading session, crashing from around $114 down to roughly $99. That is an enormous single-session move. Oil traders were pricing in a ceasefire. But here's the thing. The strikes never actually stopped. And by Tuesday, Brent had climbed back above $101. This is what happens when you have a market trying to price in a peace deal that one side says doesn't exist, but we'll get to that in a moment. Goldman Sachs has put out projections suggesting these elevated oil prices could persist all the way through 2027. Not weeks, not months, years. If that projection holds, the ripple effects across the global economy are enormous. And you're already feeling it at the pump. The national average for a gallon of regular gasoline has hit $3.84. Before this war started, it was $2.98. That's an 86-cent increase per gallon. For the average American household, which drives roughly 15,000 miles a year and gets somewhere around 28 miles per gallon, that works out to roughly $460 more per year in gas costs alone. That's a real number. That's money out of real people's pockets. And gas prices don't move in isolation. When fuel costs go up, transportation costs go up. When transportation costs go up, the price of getting goods from point A to point B increases. That cost gets passed on to consumers. It shows up in your grocery bill, in the price of everyday products, in the cost of shipping. Oil is the bloodstream of the global economy. When it gets more expensive, everything gets more expensive. Now, here's the piece of this puzzle that doesn't get enough attention, and it might be the most important part of the whole story. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. Iran declared it closed to American, Israeli, and Western allied shipping on March 4th, and it has stayed closed. Now, if you're not familiar with the Strait of Hormuz, let me give you a quick geography lesson, because understanding this waterway is key to understanding why the oil market is reacting the way it is. The strait is a narrow strip of water, just 21 miles across at its narrowest point, that connects the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. It sits between Iran to the north and Oman to the south. And through that 21-mile choke point flows roughly 20% of all global seaborne oil. 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves through a stretch of water you could drive across in about 20 minutes. U.S. intelligence has confirmed the presence of Iranian naval mines in the strait. At least a dozen MDM-3 and MDM-7 limpet mines have been identified. Over 150 commercial vessels, including oil tankers, are currently stalled in the surrounding waters, unable to transit. GPS jamming of unknown origin is disrupting navigation, creating collision risks for ships carrying millions of barrels of crude. Shipping insurance premiums have spiked 4 to 6 times their pre-war levels for a single very large crude carrier, one of those massive tankers that carries around 2 million barrels of oil. That insurance increase alone adds $250,000 per transit. That cost doesn't disappear. It gets baked into the price of the oil. It gets passed on to the consumer. Here's how global the ripple effect is. The US asked NATO allies to send naval support to help reopen the strait. They said no. The US asked Japan, South Korea, and Australia. They also said no. Countries that depend heavily on Gulf oil are not willing to get involved in reopening a waterway that Iran controls, at least not right now. Saudi Arabia has been rerouting its oil exports through its Red Sea port. The UAE has been diverting exports through an inland pipeline to bypass the Gulf entirely. The world's major oil producers are working around the strait because they can't go through it. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, released a record 400 million barrels from strategic petroleum reserves back on March 11th. That was designed to cool prices and ease supply concerns. It helped for about a week. Then prices started climbing again. It was not enough. And it's not just oil. Let's talk about what this conflict is doing to the bond market, because this one has a direct line to your mortgage. When Trump made his peace announcement on Truth Social, bond markets reacted alongside oil markets. The 20-year U.S. Treasury yield had been elevated, and there was a brief moment where it looked like it might come down. But within 24 hours of the peace announcement, as it became clear that the conflict was continuing, the 20-year Treasury yield spiked back to 5%. Why does that matter to you? Because mortgage rates track Treasury yields very closely. When the 20-year yield is at 5%, mortgage rates trend towards 7% or above. That means if you're looking to buy a home, refinance, or take out any kind of loan, you're doing it in a high-cost environment that's being partly driven by geopolitical uncertainty in the Middle East. Higher oil prices also feed directly into inflation expectations. And when inflation expectations rise, the Federal Reserve feels pressure to keep interest rates higher for longer. That affects car loans, credit card rates, business borrowing costs, the entire credit environment. The bond market, the oil market, and the maritime insurance market are all doing the same thing right now. They're all pricing in a conflict with no defined end date. That's the market's honest assessment of where things stand. Okay, here's where the story gets really interesting. Let's talk about the peace deal. Specifically, the peace deal that one side says doesn't exist. On March 22nd, President Trump posted on Truth Social that the United States and Iran had held productive conversations toward a complete and total resolution. He announced a 5-day freeze on strikes against Iranian power plants. He described major points of agreement. Reports from multiple outlets indicated that a 15-point ceasefire framework had been sent to Tehran through Pakistani intermediaries, with Vice President Vance, Secretary of State Rubio, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner named as participants. That's a significant set of claims. A 15-point framework, productive conversations, major points of agreement. Iran's response was about as clear as it gets. The Speaker of Iran's parliament stated publicly that no negotiations of any kind had taken place with the United States. The Iranian Foreign Ministry confirmed there had been no direct or indirect dialogue with Washington. Foreign Minister Araghchi went on CBS News and said Iran never requested a ceasefire and never asked for negotiations. Iran's position is that any mediation requests, whether they come from Turkey, Pakistan, or Egypt, should be directed at Washington. Because from Tehran's perspective, they didn't start this. IRGC-affiliated media went further, warning that special plans were being prepared that would, in their language, remove any hope of negotiation from the minds of the aggressors. On the same day Trump declared victory, the IDF struck more than 50 targets inside Iran. Iran responded with a strike that forced the Israeli Knesset, Israel's parliament, to evacuate a late-night session. So, when you look at the oil market reaction, the 13% crash when peace was announced, followed by the climb back up when it became clear nothing had actually changed, that's the market doing what markets do. Pricing in reality. And the reality, based on what both sides are saying publicly, is that there is no active negotiation. There is no deal on the table. There is no one sitting on the other side of the negotiating table. There's one more dimension to this story that I think is being significantly underreported, and it has to do with who Iran is putting in charge as this conflict continues. A common assumption is that when you eliminate an adversary's senior leadership, you degrade their ability to function. The logic is no experienced leadership means more chaos, more hesitation, more willingness to negotiate. The pattern in this conflict is suggesting something different. Ali Larijani was one of Iran's most prominent national security figures. He came from a political dynasty, he had extensive diplomatic experience, and he was widely regarded as a pragmatist, someone who understood negotiation, someone who had back-channel relationships, someone who understood that sometimes you have to make deals. He was killed in an Israeli strike on March 17th. Intelligence Minister Esmail Khatib was killed the following day. A Basij commander was killed the same week. On March 24th, Iran named Mohammad Bakr Zolgadar as Larijani's successor. Here's his background. He's 72 years old, 4 decades inside the IRGC, former deputy commander of the Revolutionary Guards, former deputy interior minister for security, former deputy chief of the armed forces for Basij affairs. The paramilitary wing focused on crushing internal dissent. No diplomatic background, no known back-channel history whatsoever. The pragmatist was replaced by a hardliner from the coercive wing of the regime. The command structure didn't fracture after these assassinations. It consolidated. And it consolidated around the IRGC, the most hardline element of the Iranian government. If your strategy for ending a conflict is to eliminate leaders and expect softer replacements, that strategy is not producing the expected results here. So let's bring this all together because I think the full picture is important. You have a conflict that is now in its 4th week, 79 waves of incoming fire. Israel conserving interceptors, Iran still with an estimated 1,000 ballistic missiles in reserve, the U.S. deploying between 6,000 and 7,000 additional troops. The Strait of Hormuz closed, with 150 commercial vessels stalled and naval mines confirmed. Oil at $101 a barrel, and Goldman Sachs projecting elevated prices through 2027. Gas up 86 cents a gallon, mortgage rates pressing towards 7%, NATO and Asia-Pacific allies declining to help reopen the strait. A peace deal announced by the White House that the other side publicly and repeatedly says does not exist. And a leadership transition in Tehran moving away from pragmatism and toward the hardline. Every major market, oil, bonds, maritime insurance, is pricing in a conflict with no defined end. That's not speculation. That's what the numbers say. The gap between the situation on the ground and the narrative coming out of Washington is significant. And that gap is exactly what this channel exists to track. Because whether you're an investor, a business owner, someone planning a big purchase, or just someone trying to understand why your gas and groceries are more expensive, this story has direct, real-world financial consequences for regular people. We're going to keep tracking it. That's it for today's breakdown. If you found this useful, please hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next update. This story is moving fast, and we'll be here covering every development as it happens. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think a resolution is coming? Do you think the economic pressure is going to get worse before it gets better? I read every single comment, and I genuinely want to know what you think. I'm Lauren. This is Frontline Finance. I'll see you in the next one.